Hey everybody, Bill in Virginia, and it's time for another weekly update. This week I'm going to kind of continue where I left off with the stream channel build. Not so much the stream channel, although I do have epoxy water. I'm going to do that for another video. But I'm going to show you how I did this scene. That's coming up, so stay tuned. What I'm going to do tonight is I'm going to show a little bit of how I do mountain building. Basically rock forming and carving using Sculpt-A-Mold and good old plaster of Paris. A little bit of old school techniques here that encompasses mostly getting the materials in and doing some shaping to give them some realistic shapes. Anyway, that's what's coming up next, so stay tuned. So as I get started, here is all the tools I use for mountain building. The Sculpt-A-Mold comes out 2 scoops Sculpt-A-Mold to 1 scoop water. Put it in the mix, and that's what I put on for my base. Now, if I'm doing a small area, I will do it as 2 scoops and 1 scoop water, and I'll mix it and just make very small batches. For this particular area, since right now I'm just going to be using the Sculpt-A-Mold to be a filler, to kind of fill in the cracks and crevices and start to get a basic shape, I'm going to mix up a double batch. That'll get me a little bit farther and I won't have to remake as often. And first batch starting to go on. This one is just to fill in shape. Doesn't have to be pretty. Doesn't have to do anything for carving. This is just to fill in and start getting the area ready for a second batch of Sculpt-A-Mold and then the plaster. Sculpt-A-Mold is forgiving. It's fairly light. You know, once it dries, it's hard. It loses a lot of the water content, so it's not adding a significant amount of weight to the layout or to the frame as I'm working on it here. So, okay, good enough. More after I get a little bit more done. All right, 20 minutes since the last piece. You know, this is N scale, so this really is not a big area. All right, so for this, I want the rock layers to kind of go like this. That'll match up with what I've done over there. But what I'm going to do first is just start to splot the plaster on in different areas. I'm not worried about neatness, I just don't want it to get onto the tracks. But I'll kind of get some stuff going here. All right, about another 20 minutes. So I've got the basics in for the plaster, and now I'm going to start doing some carving. I've got some shapes in where I want it to kind of show where I'm going to be putting in rock beds. And the next is going to give it some definition using that small putty knife. All right, let the carving begin. So what I'm wanting to do is I'm wanting to highlight where some of the rock layers are. I don't want to take them off, and I don't want to dig too deep. I want to make some grooves and some crevices where the stain will settle in as I'm doing this, and kind of highlight it, that it's you know, rocks, and it's separation of rock. And again, it doesn't have to be perfect. You don't want it perfect because there's nothing perfect in the real world. And then we come down this way, kind of a continuation. You know, the rocks are going to change direction slightly as they're kind of going around different curves. So if it doesn't look totally straight, don't worry about it. All right. Not bad for a couple minutes worth of work. All right. Here we go. Now, I could have used painter's tape on my track, but the crumbles are dry. It'll come off. And if I do have anything that I need to do some touch-up paint, I'll just use rail tie brown, paint it a little bit, clean it up, ballast it, and you'll never see it. So we've got rock units that are kind of at an angle. Those do match up reasonably well with these. These are a little more steep. This one's even more steep. but again, these are blocks, not necessarily what's coming from the mountain. They're blocks that have been disassociated along a fault line, giving it a curve. So coming around on this side, and you can see how the bluff side kind of angle and kind of go in like this, kind of down, which is how this mountain's going to look overall. Next thing will be to let it dry a little bit, then I'll come back with the brush, clean off the crumbles, vacuum it up, and we're ready to put some stain on this piece and then some acrylics. All right, about another 5 minutes after the last video, I used my little wire brush and I cleaned off a lot of the little nubbies that was left over from the plaster work and carving. So the rock is ready for stain and acrylics. You know, this is the easy part, but it's also the part where if you do use the stains, you want to have good ventilation. You know, I'm out in a garage, so I can open some doors, I can get some good air flowing in, so I don't really have to worry too much about the fumes building up. If you're in a house, you know, you might want to have fans. Do it when you can open some doors. And you might want to do it when you've got large areas ready to do it, just so that you can get stuff done and it's done, because it smells for a few days. All right, let's start putting some on. Here's the stain that I use. I use natural wood stain, I use a flagstone, and then I use a summer oak. Summer oak's the darker, the flagstone gives it a slight grayish tint, and then natural is more just what it is, it's a clear. I use it as a thinner to kind of give variation to the tones of the varnish, you know, and you'll see what I do here in a second. So you can see in my palette just a random mix of the 3 different colors. I'm not going to mix them up, I'm just going to let that happen naturally as I'm applying the stain to the rock formations. I want to do the darker where it stands out more, so like on ridges, and you just paint it in. Work it in, let the bristles kind of do their thing. It's going to soak in. You can cut it with the regular varnish, but you want to kind of get it across the whole area. Kind of lighter in some of the upper areas. You want to get it dark. And you can always go back and add a little bit more in certain areas to bring out some of the highlights. Change out color. Now I will get some of the acrylic paints out. I'll show you what I'm going to do with that. And here's the 3 basic acrylic colors I use on the mountain building. So I've got a brown, I use a plaid, which is sort of an antique kind of white, and then I use a light gray. And who says junk mail doesn't serve a purpose? There's my palette, 3 little blobs, and I might need more. We'll see how it goes. So what I do is I will use the darker brown with a little bit of white and just start dabbing it on the high spots, whatever colors you're interested in. It really doesn't make a lot of difference unless you are trying to be absolutely prototypical. You know, then you might want to do some straight colors of some along where you're at, but this is just to kind of give it a look of layering. All right, there we go. Next step is Here's how it looks overall. Still wet, just a few minutes after that last little segment here. So let me just kind of come over this way. In the morning it should look more dull because the colors will. You might be wondering why I have the wax paper here. That separates the bottom of the mountain from the top of the mountain. If you looked at some of the earlier videos, you know the top of this lifts off. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use wax paper all the way around as I build up the mountain, and I will do the bottom part first, then I will come back, move the wax paper over what I've just done, and then do the top part. And then I will hide the seam using vegetation, trees, just sort of how the rock lays out, so that if I need to lift the top off, I can. and that actually gives me access to an area underneath that I'm going to use for storage. One last thing that I do, and that will be it for tonight, and I've already done it, is I take a paper towel, I wad it up, and I blot the rock face and actually kind of run it through. You can kind of see over here a little piece of paper towel stuck. One, it smooths out the rock so that I get certain areas that kind of look like that, and it takes out a lot of the excess paint and stain and gives it a little bit more natural appearance. So that's the last thing I'm going to do tonight. Now I'm going to let it dry and then see how it looks in the morning. It is Friday morning. I have been outside in the garage for about an hour. I took the day off. We're going to have a long holiday weekend. What I've done this morning, though, is I've added more ballast. I've touched up the track a little bit where there was some plaster. I've also added in more scenery and ground cover. But you can see how the rock looks. It is dried. Well, actually, it's still damp to the touch, but this is going to be how it's going to look once everything is fully dried. It'll take days before it's completely dry, including the plaster. But you can see how the rocks look. The different colors, the variation, the strata that go into the rocks. It's a small scene on an N-scale layout, but I think it's an effective scene. Come over this way, you can see how the tilting strata is in the rocks. Look at the start of the video, you can see just how the pink foam board was. All of this was done simply. Again, sculpt a mold for your base, kind of give it a rough shape, come in with some thick plaster, kind of figure out what you want to do, and then lather it on, thicker in the areas where you want it to stick out, less in the areas that you don't, and then come back in with a putty knife and carve the dickens out of it. And there you go. So that's it for this video. You take care and keep having fun on your layouts.